All right, U.S. auto sales data starting to trickle in for the quarter, for the month of March as well. A lot of fear here that obviously the shutdown with regards to the coronavirus, keeping people away from dealerships. We're seeing some pretty brutal numbers here. To help break it all down, we want to bring in Jessica Caldwell. She's Edmunds market researcher and executive director of Insights. Jessica, I appreciate you being here. We've seen these numbers, the quarterly numbers out of GM, out of Fiat Chrysler, much worse than what some people have expected. When you look at some of the monthly data we're getting out of the Asian automakers, Hyundai, Mazda, we're talking about 40% declines in the month of March. This is for March. This is for the first quarter. What are you expecting for April? What are you expecting for May? What are you expecting for the rest of the year?
I think April is going to be the really tough month. Actually, if we looked at January and February sales, we were in the U.S. in a pretty decent place. Sales were actually up. However, everything changed, I would say, after March 13th, and the president addressed the nation on the 12th. So what we'll see for April, likely very soft. We're going to have a whole month of sales that will likely be depressed, given that most people will have a shelter in place until April 30th. I think the rest of the question for the rest of the quarter really remains of how quickly those shelter-in-place orders, how fast they're going to lift, and if so, will people be able to recover enough financially to buy a new vehicle? Because as we know, people have been furloughed, they've taken salary reductions, people have been laid off. It's pretty tough out there to make a big purchase.
Absolutely. And Jessica, I know that April is normally one of the better months of the year for auto sales. Early on in this pandemic, people were saying a lot of the lost sales would just be delayed. They weren't permanently lost. What is your sense now that sales that we're not getting in the auto sector, is that lost or is it delayed?
I think the majority will be delayed because I think for people that are in the car buying cycle, what we've seen with other things, hurricanes, the Japanese tsunami, some of the other big incidents, is that they do come back into the market. It does take longer as people kind of find their financial footing again. They may be a little trigger shy right following, but I think by the end of the year, things should look better, particularly if we have a slow selling summer, which is a time in which automakers roll out a lot of incentive programs and also do the model year sell down. So if there's a lot of inventory left over from that point, I think the year end could be a stronger point because, from an automaker perspective, they can't operate on low sales. They're going to have some real financial issues in terms of production. So they're going to need to do something to entice consumers to come back into the market.
Okay, well, I'm curious, Jessica, as to sort of what that method would be. As far as the interest rates, interest rates are already relatively low, particularly if you had good credit. You can pretty much walk into a dealer and drive off the lot without more than a percentage point or two, if even that. And then you talk about the inventory levels as they start to try to work those down. Even if you start cutting the price, how much further or how much of a cushion do they have to cut those prices to get those sales before it completely just erodes any sort of idea of profitability for these companies?
Yeah, I think right now the issue is the incentives are very generous. A lot of automakers are offering 0% financing for 84 months. Of course, you have to have good credit. But I think the problem there is that people are just not feeling comfortable to buy cars, not only from a financial perspective, but a process perspective. People don't necessarily want to go into a dealership and an F&I office, and a lot of automakers have rolled out these, online platforms in which they can buy the vehicle, so that kind of calms some of those interests. But of course, there's also the financial concerns. So I think if people, the shelter-in-place orders are lifted, people are feeling a bit financially and start to recover a bit, I think those incentives will be a lot more impactful than they are at this moment. I think right now automakers are just trying to throw out a lifeline to get any consumers that may be interested in buying a car into, not into the dealerships, but, into that process again.
Yeah. Jessica, we talk a lot about how corporate behavior, individual behavior will change as a result of this coronavirus pandemic. When the virus eventually passes, and at some point it will, do you think Americans will be more inclined to avoid public transportation, steer away from ride-hailing car services, and instead rely more on private cars and want to stock up and perhaps people who weren't thinking of buying cars would be more inclined to buy cars? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes to how deep this is, if we're in shelter in place for a few more months and it continues at the pace that we've seen it over the last few weeks in terms of levels of panic and illness and whatnot, I think that could be, a really real thing. And, it's extremely interesting just because the focus of the past few years for the automakers has been on ride sharing, ride hailing, autonomous cars. And I don't think that solution, particularly for autonomous cars, is going to go away. But the idea that people want to share cars, I feel like may be tempered, at least in the short term. I think in the long term, probably not so much. But I think people will be, a bit scarred and a bit shy from this incident.
So, Jessica, in past crises, we've tended to see pretty large structural shifts in various industries as they respond to just a general shift in consumer psychology out there. I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier this idea that some people might be a little bit afraid to go into a dealership, to be around any sort of crowded environment like that. Is this the type of thing that maybe does push us to more of a direct sales system, kind of what Tesla has been pushing for so long and what states, for a variety of reasons, have pushed back against?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe not directly like the Tesla model in terms of direct sale, but I think the ability to do a lot more of your transaction online before you get to the dealership, I think that might be something that we see post this pandemic. I think people will feel more comfortable with this process, and perhaps retailers too will feel more comfortable, with this process because, they have not always been a particular proponent for a lot of, online retailing, but, the world is changing. It's changed dramatically. So, I do imagine most parties would be more amicable to this solution, moving forward.